Okay, so the last example, right? The last example for the ClassA subnetting is that what is given is the IP address, right? The 10.0.0.0, and then the subnet mask is /26. That's what's given. So basically, /26 means 255.255.255.192. Okay, so that's a /26. So let me just draw the IP address structure for class A. Right, there are 4 octets, and you know the first octet is network portion, right? And then since this is a case 3, right? Since this is a case 3, X, the subnet area, right? This is long, right? And this is like first octet, second and third and fourth, right? And then let me just write the subnet mask: 255.255.255.192, right? So 192 means what? 1, right? 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? So basically it's so it's a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right? And then there's a 2 ones. So 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? So basically, so this is X, right? And this is Y. And you know that this X ends, or the this X ends in the 4th octet area, right? And that's why it's the case 3, right? So what we have to really focus is the 4th octets, right? So that means subnetting is really performed in the 4th octet, right? So that's what we have to really focus. Okay, so this is a 4th octet, right? Okay, so then so next is, since we know the X and Y, right? So the X is 8 plus 2, right? So basically X is 8 plus 8 plus 2, you know, 8, and then this 2, right? So that's what, 18, and then Y is 6. So from this we can find the number of subnets, which is 2 to the X, and then from this we can find a usable host IP addresses, you know, per each subnet, which is 2 to the 6 minus 2, right? Which is 62. Okay. Now, so we have to look at the let's see. Okay, so as you can see, this is the case 3 of ClassA subnetting, right? So I already answered the first and the second questions, right? And now the third one, the most important question. So what are the valid subnet IP addresses, right? So that's something that we have to find out. The third one. Oops. Okay. Okay. So now So we have to really use the formula, right? So which means 256 minus, right? Let me just write this formula right here. There's a formula we have to use, a 256 minus 192, because we have to really focus on the fourth octet, which is 192, and 4 what? And then 64, right? So the 64. So we know that the fourth octet, right? The really, so the fourth octet, right? The address IP address of the fourth octet is really like in the multitude of 64. So starting from 0 and then 64, right? And when I add another 64, I have 128. And then if I add another 64, I have what? I have 192, right? So, 64, and then I add another 64, then I have 192, right? Okay, so having said that, the first IP address, right? The IP address of the first subnet is 10.0.0.0, right? So I said it's a fourth octet. So this is a fourth octet, and this is 0, right? And the second, right? The network address of the second subnet is next one is 64, right? So this is the first subnet address, the valid subnet address, and then second is what? 10.0.0.64, right? So here's a 64, and then so this is the network address of the second subnet, right? And then the third, the network address of the third subnet, right, is 10.0.0.128, right? So 128, and the last one is 192, and the network address of the fourth subnet is 10.0.0.192, right? Oops, 192. Okay, so then what is the next one? So if we add 64, right? So for example, if I add another 64, I will have 256, right? But you know that I cannot really use 256 because with 8-bit, 255 is the maximum number, right? So 1 has to be carried to the third octet, right? So it's going to be, the next one is 10.0.1.0, right? 0, right? So I just use a 0. And the next one is obviously, it's what? 64. So it's going to be 10.0.1.64. And then I'll have a 1.128. And then I'll have a 1.192, right? And then I'll have I cannot have a 1.256, right? So it's gonna be, now I have a 2, right? 2.0, and then 2.64, and just keep going, right? So now you see the patterns, right? The patterns is that this 0, 64, 128, 192, that repeats. 0, 64, 128, 192, 0, 64, 128, 198, etc. But the third octet, it's initially is a 0, right? 0, right? And then it's a 1, right? And then it becomes 2, right? That's a third octet. So basically the pattern that you can see is this. Now so this is like third octets. For the 0, and then this is a fourth octet. We have 0, 64, 128, and 192, right? So this is a yellow, and then fourth octet is a green, right? And then next one is 1, right? But this repeats, right? It's 0, 64, 128, and 192. And then we have a 2. We have a 0, 64, 128, and 192. And then this third octet will become 3. And then this number will repeat, right? These patterns, and etc. Okay? And of course, this is a third octet, it's yellow. And these are the fourth octet, right? This number repeats, right? This numbers, as we can, is a repeats, right? This number. Okay, and another thing, the broadcast address, right? Broadcast address of the first broadcast address of the first subnet is what? 10.0.0.63, right? So this is a broadcast address of the first subnet. And yeah, and the broadcast, let's say broadcast address of the fourth subnet is what? This is a little bit challenging, but 10.0. Right? 0.255. So that's the the broadcast address of the fourth subnet, right? And another thing is, let's take a look at the, okay. And this is the fifth and sixth, right? And this is a seventh, eighth, right? And then ninth subnet. So I can ask you to, let's say, the broadcast address of the eighth subnet, right, is going to be what? 1.255, right? So that's a broadcast address of the eighth subnet. Okay. So basically the idea is when I ask you to find the broadcast address, like for example, like broadcast address of the fourth octet, the best way to solve the problem is you first find network address, right? Network address of the fifth subnet minus 1. So for example, so broadcast address of the fourth subnet, right, is equal the network address, right, the fifth subnet minus 1, right? Then you can get the broadcast address of the fourth subnet. Okay, okay, so I think that's the this is the last example of the class A subnetting. Okay, thank you.